Hey, Jeff, in case I
Yes.
don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
From the Truman Show.
From The Truman Show,
There
the
you go,
very
there you go. Yep,
last
yep.
words from The Truman Show.
That's right. So this is all about Paul's final words. Is that what
Very
you're?
final words.
Yeah, there you go.
He's done a lot of finals,
Yeah.
but this is
it.
This is definitely it.
Yep. So this is the last we hear of Paul. So he's Chris and I'm Jeff, and we're the Bible guys.
So this is the final of all finals.
There you go.
Hey, before we get into that, though, we have a segment which is actually quite the opposite of yesterday's segment. Yesterday's segment was what made Chris mad this week.
Yeah.
And
Which is the best. I love those.
Which I actually am mad about the fact that they ask you always what made Jeff happy this week.
Is that going to be your next what made Chris mad this week?
Yes. What made Chris mad this week was the fact that they always ask you what makes you happy.
Okay, what made me happy this week? Nothing. Nothing made me happy this week. Well, we just finished up Easter,
Yes.
right? So
Yep.
everybody's
Yep.
listening a little. We're ahead usually, so it's a couple weeks ahead for you now. I know our listeners, but we just finished up Easter, and the gospel presentation that, by the way, you and your team put together was phenomenal. On this Easter service, Chris, you wrote the message, right? You wrote the message, and then the different preachers, whether it was me or Tom or you, we all shared that same message. And so I like to tell people sometimes that, Chris made the pizza, we all delivered it, right? It's kind of how it worked. And
There you go.
so, but when it came to the end of the gospel presentation, I would lead in a sinner's prayer. I know sinner's prayers don't save anybody, but for me, when I trusted Jesus, I can remember the day when I got on my knees and I just told Jesus that I knew I was a sinner, but I wanted him to be the king of my life, right? And I believed in the resurrection. I believed that he paid the price for me. And so I asked him to save me. So I think there's some usefulness in it, similar to maybe the thief on the cross who said, Jesus, remember me, right? And so at the end of the message, in the last service, we did 10 identical services in Sterling Heights and 4 up in Imlay City. At the end of the very last service, it was all done, and I'm leading in this prayer, and there's, how many people were in the room? 500 people in the room, maybe?
Last service, yeah, more like
491,
six, something.
yeah. So this woman was sitting second row, just off to my right, and
Oh, yeah, I
her hands were folded, and she was bowed. Her head was bowed, and she had a real intensity on her face. And what made me look up was, because as every head bowed, every eye closed, what made me look up was she was praying out loud, "Dear Jesus, I admit that I'm a sinner. I live my life my own way, but as best as I know how, I invite Jesus in my life. I believe you paid the price and rose again. Would you be the Lord of my life?" And she was just praying out loud, and it was like she was in this isolation booth, and nobody else was there with her.
Right.
It was just her and God in that moment.
Yeah.
And man, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of people walk through the door who heard the gospel. But it was like God just reminded me in that moment, it's all about one person. For each of those people who trusted Christ in the services, and we had hundreds of people trust Christ, for them, it was just them and God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how God works, right? Is he works in large crowds, but he works individual hearts.
Right.
And that was really powerful. So I think that is the thing that made me happy. The other thing that made me happy is, we live in Michigan, which is I think the third grayest state in the country.
Ugh.
We have so many gray days, but we have had other than, some of the rainy
Can't
days,
stand it.
we have had particularly blue skies this
Yeah,
spring.
that's true.
And so, dude, I just found myself walking through parking lots, just whistling, humming along, feeling like
I'll
$1 million bucks.
I'll tell you,
and so I'm loving the blue skies
when
of
the
the spring.
sky is blue and the sun is shining, everybody in Michigan has immediately gone up 3 levels.
Yeah, I think all the people
in
live
their
like
mood.
in San Diego or somewhere, and it's like it's easy to serve Jesus there.
Right. Did I ever tell you, I lived in Atlanta for 10 and a half years, and I moved up here, and I moved here in 2004, and one of my good friends said, let's go play baseball. And we were out in the middle of the field, and in fact, I'll just tell you what it was. It was Dave Wilson, and another guy that was there was John Borglin, who's probably listening to this, by the way, right now.
Hi, John.
Hey, John. And anyway, and John will remember this, because basically here's what happens. We're out there playing, and the sky is perfectly blue. billowy clouds, and it's like 80 something degrees, and it's beautiful. It's absolutely perfect weather. And I remember Borglund says to Wilson, he goes, "Dude, Wilson," he goes, "you could not have picked a better day to come out and play baseball." And they kept on saying it over and over. Like after the third time, I looked over and I looked up at the clouds and I said, "What? It's just a normal day." Right? So in other words, like I'm thinking in my
You're
mind,
so accustomed to blue skies.
blue skies every day in Atlanta. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't, I mean, it's a good day, but it's not an exceptional day.
Yeah.
And then I realized years later, I'm like, oh, okay.
In Michigan, we have an exceptionally high number of gray days.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Something, you only get 30 of those a year.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and we used one of them to play ball.
Right.
So what just happened there is you get all of the what made Chris's mad, and then you also get the what made Jeff's happies.
What?
Is that what happened?
Hey, listen, early on, we used to piggyback off of others' things all the time.
Yeah.
Did that
Well,
Jeff, Jeff, did that make you mad?
It made me mad. Yeah, there we go. So, no, that's fun, man. So much fun. So we're finishing this up, and then we're done with the words of Paul.
Yes.
And then next week, we're going to pivot into the words of Peter, which I think is really, really cool, right? To look into it. Peter wrote 2 short books, but they are power-packed, theology deep, really thick books. They're great. So here we go. He says, "Timothy, please come as soon as you can. Demas has deserted me because he loves the things of this life and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, be sure to bring the coat I left with Carpus at Troas. Also bring my books, and especially my papers. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm, but the Lord will judge him for what he's done. Be careful of him, for he fought against everything we said. The first time I was brought before the judge, no one came with me. Everyone abandoned me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and gave me strength so that I might preach the good news in its entirety for all the Gentiles to hear. And he rescued me from certain death. Yes, and the Lord will deliver me from every evil attack and will bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. All glory to God forever and ever. Amen. Give my greetings to Priscilla and Aquila and those living in the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus stayed at Corinth, and I left Trophimus sick at Miletus. Do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus sends you greetings, and so do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters. May the Lord be with your spirit, and may his grace be with all of you."
There's a lot of weird names in that
And
passage.
that's it. Yeah. Onesiphorus. Can you imagine looking at your baby and going, "Oh, what should we name him?" "Oh, he looks like an Onesiphorus to me."
Well, that's actually better than Pudens.
Pudens. Yeah.
I'm
Puddins. Maybe it was Puddins. Maybe that's there's oh, Puddin, right? Maybe maybe he just had a southern grandma that named him.
Yeah. Yeah, those are some serious names. But yeah, it's sort of sad, isn't it? So Paul says only Luke is with me. And he says Demas has gone off because he loves the world. I mean, Thessalonica apparently is the place to go. Everybody seems to have abandoned him. And you know what I actually thought of? I actually thought of, remember when Stephen was stoned?
Yeah.
In Acts chapter 7?
Yeah.
And he was all by himself, and he was standing in front of the Sanhedrin, and he was, saying, "Men and women," and he just went on and preached this amazing sermon, and then they pretty much killed him for it. He was standing all by himself. Stephen had nobody to advocate for him. Yeah. And here it is. Paul finds himself the victim of bad politics. People are fearing. It could be, doesn't say so, but it could be that people have thought, well, there's really no helping Paul because it's a lost situation. Right. Right. Like Nero is going to use an example of him. So they've all abandoned him, and they might have even hated to do it. Yeah. But now he's all alone.
Well, he had just written a letter to Titus, right? And Titus moves on to Dalmatia. He's already said good things about Tychicus. He sent Tychicus. So other than Demas, it doesn't say that they all left for bad reasons, but they all left. Right. And I think, people tend to leave sinking ships. It's just it's natural. And I think everybody can see the writing on the wall. Paul's about to die. Paul knows it. Yeah. But that doesn't lighten the load for him being lonely. But, this is true, not to be overly morbid. in the book of Hebrews, it says it's appointed on a man once to die, and after this, the judgment. We all will face death alone. Even if we're surrounded by family, it's just us and God. And then the judgment, when we stand before God, it's just us and God. And what we know through the rest of this book, the way that Paul wrote, was it's all about his faith in Christ that was bringing him through. I've run my race. I've done what I could. Now he was with anticipation looking forward to God. A life that's well lived doesn't leave you with a desperation of, I'm miserable and I'm alone and now I'm terrified of God. It left him with, even though everybody's gone, why don't you come to me? Bring Mark, who, by the way, I used to be ticked off at. Bring Mark, bring my books. I'd love my coat if I could get it, but I'm ready to go. And I think the message, the big picture message of the book is I'm ready to go and I'm ready to meet my maker. And I know I've been faithful and I look forward to his reward. But there is a sadness here that nobody's with him. But he is with Luke. I wonder how Luke feels. Everybody left me. Well, except Luke.
Right.
Who, by the way, was a significantly godly man to the tune that God had him write the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, the book of Acts, and he may have been the writer of 1st and 2nd Timothy.
Right, because he could have been the dictator.
Yeah, well,
right?
because we know Paul didn't write his own books.
Right.
And he didn't sign it, look, I signed this in my own hand.
Right.
So it's very likely Luke was the writer, at least of 2nd Timothy. Right? So God used him significantly. This is a pretty significant guy. This isn't just some chump. And he goes, everybody left me. I'm all, well, except Luke. But and then
only Luke is with
and then likely Luke wrote it.
Right. As he's dictating.
Yeah. Hey, bring me Mark. You know that kid I can't stand? Bring him, because all I've got is Luke.
Yeah. And
Does your mind work like that when you read the Bible?
Well, yes. Here's what I actually thought. I thought, like, John Mark, he didn't like John Mark. They parted ways.
Yeah.
And then now that everybody's abandoned him, he says, send Mark, which is John Mark. And then John's probably hearing this going, oh, so now I'm good enough.
Yeah.
But everybody's gone.
Yep.
You know, it reminds me of that episode of The Office. Do you remember when they were out scouting and Michael Scott was looking for interns? And this one kid comes along and he says, you're not good enough because he didn't look good.
Right.
He had like pimples and things like that. Yeah. And then he realized he had nobody else and he went back to try to court this kid. Right. It's so funny. I think that's John Mark, right?
Yeah.
So, that's really funny.
So just to remind you, because I think this is very significant in this passage. So Demas leaves because he loves the world. And, sometimes we're surprised by people who spring up, serving the Lord, everything's going well, and then just they suddenly go off the rails. And it's because they desire a relationship, or they desire stuff, or they suddenly, they're honoring God, but then suddenly they get a job opportunity that pulls them away from the things of God all the time, and they just are pursuing the world, right? We shouldn't be surprised by it. It happens. It's not that it should happen. Happens. Even to a guy like Demas that Paul mentioned multiple times in the other books. Demas is with me, and he's great. And all of a sudden, Demas is like, peace out, Paul. I love the world more than I love you.
Yeah, and you know what? I've often thought about that one little verse that says he loves the things of this life, and he's deserted me. And I've actually thought, like, gee, what is the things of this life?
Yeah.
And then was Demas a person who was, if he was valuable? I'm assuming it's a he, right? So I don't know why I'm assuming.
Yeah, Demas is
right.
Demas is a male.
So was he involved in public ministry? That's my question. Was he a person who spoke eloquently? Was he famous? Was he known as Paul's right-hand guy?
Right.
You know what I mean? Because the reason why I think about that is because, to be honest with you, you often see preachers fall, right?
Yeah.
Like they get sort of distracted with things that aren't as important. There are some preachers that start off with good hearts, and then they have successful ministries, and then all of a sudden they seem to be more about maybe like a salary. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are people who make millions of dollars, right?
Yeah,
I mean, like famous churches around the world, right? And it's like, and it almost seems like they sort of lost their first love of ministry, and they get caught up in popularity or feeling important.
Yeah.
Like it's easy for us to have a successful Easter in our own little world, right?
Yeah.
Our little tiny little world that we live in, and think of ourselves as somehow important or famous, even though that nobody knows us, right?
Right.
But if not careful, there are people who think that way, though. I'll give you an example. So my father-in-law was a part of this little tiny church that ran like maybe 100 people or less. and years later, this one guy who always envied he wanted to be the important guy. He eventually, as a volunteer, gets voted in as the pastor, even though he didn't have a Bible degree. But anyway, he becomes a pastor, and the whole congregation now is like 12 people. The church is like ready to die.
Yeah.
And it's everybody over 70.
Yeah.
So it's like this. It's like the saddest thing ever. And somehow, in the midst of all of that weirdness, he somehow would call my father-in-law and exercise his authority of feeling important. And my father-in-law is like, this guy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I just think like, man, it's so easy. And so anyway, all that to say, I just wonder, what are the things that tripped up Demas? And I sure hope we don't ever go down that road. Right?
Yeah,
No
the King
what it
James
is.
says, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. That's the phrase, right? So it was a worldliness thing, but there's a lot of things. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life is what James tells us are the three big
and the
temptations.
pride of life could be like, I'm important.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And so that has been a thing for a long time, for me, a challenge. I think when I was younger, I pursued being known. And somewhere, I don't know, probably in the last 10 years, I really wanted to have the greatest impact I can possibly have without being known. Right? Because I think it's a danger to me. Yeah, I think the more mature you become, the more you're aware of what are your weaknesses, what are your strengths. And I think that was a danger was I want to have the greatest impact, but I don't have a desire to be on the big stages as far as fame goes. And because I think it's dangerous. It can pull you away. The other side of it is, for some people, it's money. It's just being, like you said, being tempted to go to the bigger place or the bigger ministry because there's more money, or the bigger job just because there's more money, rather than trying to figure out, God, where do you want me to go for the greatest impact for your kingdom?
Right.
Right? Those are two totally different things. If I love the world, it's everything the world can give me is what I'm chasing.
Right.
If I love God, then it's what's going to have the greatest impact in your kingdom. And sometimes those two can converge. Sometimes the greatest impact for God's kingdom also brings along some of those other things. But like Solomon didn't ask for wealth and power. He asked for wisdom so he could be a good ruler for God. And God gave him the other things. So Jesus says in Matthew 6, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added to you. So it's not that the good things, all the things that do come along, fame and fortune and all those things, it's not that those things are to be rejected. It's just they shouldn't be sought. And I think a lot of times we make our decisions almost solely based on what can the world give me, rather than, Demas had been living the rest of his life. And this is, I think, the shift Paul sees in his life, because Paul compliments him so many times. And then now all of a sudden Paul's going, he got distracted by the world. The rest, then he begins to think all these faithful leaders, Tychicus and all these other guys. He mentions Titus had moved on, but was ministry still probably. And then Luke, he mentions Luke, which is great. And I made jokes about Luke, but what a faithful, godly man Luke is always. There's no controversy in Luke's life ever. He's one of the few people in the Bible that there's no controversy at all in his life. Paul has some controversial stuff. David, Solomon, all this, Moses, Abraham. All the heroes, they all had them. Luke is one of the few. You got Luke, you have Daniel. Joseph, yeah. Other than his pride maybe a little early in his life.
Early on, yeah.
But by the end, he was great. But there aren't many. But Luke didn't have any controversies at all and was faithful all the way to the very end. Then he's writing to Timothy, and he says, Timothy, bring me some stuff. I think it's sweet to me to hear him say, I don't need much. If I just get my coat and some of my books, he knows he's coming to the end. He doesn't need a lot of things. But asking for John Mark, and this is where we've been heading, I think, through this whole thing. He had rejected John Mark. He lost his best friend. He lost his mentor over John Mark.
Yeah.
Barnabas. So John Mark is Barnabas's nephew. And he was traveling with him, and then he bails on the very first missionary journey. On the second missionary journey, Barnabas wants to bring John Mark along, and Paul goes, heck no, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
And so Barnabas goes, well, I'm going to go encourage him. And that's when Paul moves on with Silas. And they go. So now you got two teams going. But here...
That's that nepotism.
Yeah, yeah. But late in ministry now, Paul is going, I can see it. So there's something to be said about, as you mature, looking back at all the people in your life, and just being able to recognize God used that guy. I didn't see it in him, but God used him, and I can honor that.
And it also could be a combination of things. It could be also that years have passed and he's heard great things about John Mark.
Yeah.
And maybe he's thinking like, hey, Barnabas, I'm glad you're the one that mentored him because he was
a punk.
He was a punk. And now it's years later,
Right.
and now he's not a punk. So I can stand him now.
Yeah.
But I, it's like being around a junior high student, right?
Well, we know, so Barnabas was the son of encouragement. Remember, we talked a lot about him. And so Barnabas just had this coach mentor thing in him to raise up good leaders. But we know that John Mark traveled with Peter. So he wrote the book of Mark, which probably was more Peter's story. But he wrote the book of Mark. He very likely was the author of 1st and 2nd Peter, the writer of them, very likely. And so he had an opportunity to be with Peter. And so there is a little undertone there. Because remember, Paul and Peter squared off, right? Remember? So Paul had to kind of tell Peter off about misbehaving.
For sure. Yeah, 2 different times.
So I think Paul was a little bit of a tough guy to be around, right? He wrote a lot about being peaceful, but I think it was...
You said that's one of the reasons why he was single.
Yeah, exactly, man.
That's so funny.
I think he's hard to be around. But here in his old age now, he's wanting to make peace with John Mark, which is by extension maybe making peace with Barnabas and Peter.
Yeah.
At this point, right? By coming in and honoring John Mark, there's a lot to be said about when you come to the end of your life and you don't need anything more than just your friends, a few books, the Bible, and a code. All of a sudden, that makes you start thinking about all the relationships in your life and how important they are. And I want to make sure things are right.
There's a line at the end of one of my favorite movies, The Greatest Showman, where she says, "You don't need everyone to love you, Phineas. You just need a few good people."
Yeah.
And by the way, I feel like I need to finish my sentence. I never get to say anything. I said it's like being around a junior high student, and then I wasn't able to say anything more. What I meant by that was...
Because somebody interrupted you? Did somebody interrupt you?
I didn't want to say that.
Was somebody being a jerk?
But I might have tried to insert it, okay?
All right.
But here's the point. The point is, I love junior high students, but sometimes they can be a lot of personality,
Yeah.
right? But if they're your family, right, then you have this ability to transcend, that stage of life, which I think is, similar to Paul and Barnabas, because Barnabas had a love and a toleration for John Mark.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
I love it.
So that is it for Paul. He wraps it up, and then after that, he is unfortunately killed by Emperor Nero.
Beheaded.
He's beheaded.
Very likely, according to tradition, if you've ever been to Vatican City, the big square out in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, or St. Peter's Basilica, I'm sorry, that big square out there used to be a racetrack. Did you know that? Used to be a racetrack right there that Nero had races, and they had a pillar in the middle, and that's where they would do their executions. And it's very likely that's where Paul was executed, was right there on what is now the grounds of the Vatican. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, historically, that's probably dead on. There's a lot of things that, we don't know historically where it actually happened, but that probably is it because Nero was famous for executing people on that track. Yeah.
And he was buried in the catacombs beneath the streets of Rome, most likely, and somewhere around 67 or 68 AD.
Yeah.
And we are extremely thankful for Paul.
Thank God
for
for
writing
Paul.
over just half of the New Testament.
Yeah.
So,
he taught us how to follow Jesus.
For sure.
Yep.
And reach those who are lost.
That's right.
Those who are far from God.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a good wrap up for today, and we will see you next time on the Bible Guys.